Hello, welcome to BBC News from me, Alistair Yates. The most senior security official in Iraq has told the BBC that he believes the 5 British hostages seized at gunpoint more than a year ago are still alive. Muwafaq al-Rubai says he thinks that the Iraqis know roughly where they are. The Foreign Office in London says they can't confirm the information. The comments were made during a visit to Baghdad by a senior Anglican bishop. From Baghdad, Nicholas Witchell reports.
My name is Jason and today is the 18th of November.
They've been described as the forgotten hostages, 5 Britons who were seized in Baghdad 13 months ago and from whom very little has been heard.
I've been held here for nearly 8 months now.
Only one has been named publicly, Peter Moore, a computer expert who was shown on a hostage video last February.
I just want to get out of here.
Now, from the Iraqi capital, there is a small glimmer of hope. This is the Right Reverend Michael Lewis, Anglican Bishop of the Gulf, making his first visit to the most troubled city in his diocese, Baghdad. He has not come specifically to seek the hostages' release, but he is meeting senior political and religious figures, including Iraq's National Security Advisor, Muwafaq al-Rubai, and Ayatollah Hussein al-Sadr, cousin of the radical Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. The bishop's appeal is for God's mercy to be shown to those in need.
It can be an appeal that remembers the families of the 5 who are held, and I make that appeal, and I ask them to consider messages that have been passed to them from many sources, asking for mercy and compassion.
Then, from Iraq's most senior security official, this optimistic assessment about the hostages.
We have a very good, strong intelligence telling us they are alive, and we roughly know the area where they are now. But we don't want to be aggressive in our approach, not to risk their lives.
It's expected, though, that it will still be some time before there's progress towards freeing them. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, Baghdad.
The mayor of Mexico City has accused the police of making serious errors when they raided a nightclub on Friday, leading to a stampede in which at least 12 people died. Police arrested the club's owner, saying he spread panic by announcing as the raid began that everyone was going to be arrested. Duncan Kennedy reports from Mexico.
Inside and out, there was chaos as the young partygoers poured out onto the streets. Once the extent of the stampede became clear, emergency teams arrived to help with the evacuation. Stretcher after stretcher brought out those who had survived and those who had not. Most of those who died were suffocated in the crush to get out. At least 500 young people have been in the club celebrating the end of the school term. It's thought at least 9 young people and 3 police officers died in the rush to escape the club. The deaths and injuries occurred after police came to raid the club. They were there to investigate reports drugs and alcohol were being sold to minors. According to police, the club owner then announced to the crowd the officers were there to arrest everybody, which led to the stampede. The police denied they fired a round of tear gas. They say there was a single entrance door and one emergency exit, which was blocked by cases of beer. The club had been closed down last year for violating safety rules, but the owner won an injunction to reopen the venue. Both he and nearly 40 other people have been arrested. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News, in Mexico City.
Argentine farmers have lifted most of their roadblocks across the country after coming to a temporary agreement to end a dispute which has caused chaos for 3 months. It began after an increase in taxes on some agricultural exports. The matter is to be debated by the Argentine Congress.
Hello there. Typhoon Fenjing will be somewhat of a menace across parts of the Philippines for the next few days. There it is, the area of cover, slowly churning its way west-northwest. The centre very close to Luzon, moving across as well over the next couple of days with wind gusts easily over 150 kilometres an hour. We're going further west and you can see a lot of showers across much of India. The monsoon continued to do well. A weak area of low pressure helping to enhance some of these showers over northeastern India. Further west than that, high pressure keeping the weather fairly dry and warm. Temperatures into a few spots easily in the middle 40s for the next few days. For South America, a few showers for Rio. Buenos Aires on the cool side, and Santiago looking fine and dry for the next couple of days. The US looking good. Some showers over New York, Miami. Elsewhere looking good for LA and Vancouver. That's the weather for now.
Swamad's encounter with abuse is just one story, but it's a problem repeated across the continent of Africa.
Everybody says they love children, and how could they subject them to any type of violence?
Over the last few weeks, we've been travelling around Zimbabwe, building up the picture of how this election campaign has been conducted. But what's emerged is a fairly consistent picture that ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe are absolutely determined to hold on to power and to do so by any means necessary.
Here in Africa, levels of war and violence have largely fallen dramatically, replaced by elections and often multi-party democracies. But with high energy and food prices creating new political and social pressures, are the new democracies really robust enough to cope? Join me, Nick Gowing, here in Cape Town for the BBC World Debate.
This July, World News Today gets a brand new edition.
I think that our audience is looking for much more than the headlines. They're looking for the angles that haven't been covered.
Another dedicated hour of in-depth news.
So often I've wanted the time to ask that one extra question, and now this is my chance to do that.
China is fast becoming a global superpower. But who has been driving this phenomenal rise? And what has been driving them? BBC World News meets China's top entrepreneurs in an up-close and personal new series, Asian Business Leaders. Climate change, carbon emissions, heard it all before?
In the 20th century, we made cities much more for cars than for people.
It's time for a change.
It's a plus energy house.
Water Waste is an inspiring new series searching the globe for the blueprints of a green future.
We are just architects.
This July on BBC World News. Now on BBC World News, in a programme recorded prior to the arrest of one of the panel, Tende Biti, are African leaders confident enough to allow political opposition and fair elections? It's the World Debate.
Welcome to Cape Town in South Africa. Hello, I'm Nick Gowing. The levels of violence and war across this continent have fallen dramatically. New data confirms most African countries are more stable and democratic. But what kind of democracy, and why are high economic growth rates and the way of governing, what's called governance, threatening new instability? In this BBC World Debate we ask, is political transition Africa's Achilles heel? Here in South Africa, Nelson Mandela's political skills and influence guided peaceful change from apartheid to multiracial democracy. Mandela gave political transition here iconic status. 14 years on, South Africa gets good marks from 5 of 6 governance indicators compiled by the World Bank Institute. But for this rainbow nation, there are still uncomfortable issues, as in all parts of Africa. These attacks on tens of thousands of migrants highlight why South Africa is way behind on the 6th indicator, political stability and absence of violence. President Mbeki condemned the violence as shameful and criminal and deployed the army, but the tensions did not diminish. South Africa's Institute of Race Relations believes there are anything from 3 to 5 million migrants who have some form of sanctuary in South Africa. At least 3 million risked life and limb to cross the border from Zimbabwe. They left behind an economy in free-fall crisis, the highest inflation by far in the world, 80% unemployment and shortages of all kind. Elections in March left Zimbabwe in a new limbo. President Mugabe's party, ZANU-PF, lost its majority in the House of Assembly for the first time since independence in 1980. Zimbabwe's presidency is the more powerful institution. Who will be president remains unclear. Despite setbacks, there is widespread consensus that on governance, Africa is moving forward. The latest OECD African Economic Outlook says more and more countries are legitimizing their governments through universal elections. In 2007, more than 54 million Africans in 18 states participated in a total of 19 presidential and parliamentary elections. But as Kenya's disputed presidential election and the subsequent violence and bloodletting showed, progress is often still fragile. Much has still not been achieved in most of Africa on rule of law, government transparency, freedom of the press, and above all corruption, which the OECD says remains widespread at all levels. So, holding free elections is a good start. But why do they leave many other elements of necessary political progress untackled and still embedded in public life? That is the BBC World Debate. Welcome to the World Economic Forum Africa Regional Summit here in Cape Town, where these issues are centre stage for hundreds of business and political leaders at the highest level, plus some of the next generation from across Africa and beyond. Is Africa's great potential still being held up by these deep and troubling governance issues relating to political transitions in countries across this vast continent? Well, I'm joined here by John Kufuor, who is the President of Ghana for almost 8 years. You've been called the gentle giant of the continent, praised for leading the country to the highest levels of governance. Raila Odinga, Prime Minister in Kenya's new coalition government formed after the deadly ethnic violence that followed the bitterly disputed presidential election at the end of last December. Tendai Biti, Secretary General of Zimbabwe's Movement for Democratic Change, that's been so relentlessly challenging the leadership and governance record of President Robert Mugabe and his ZANU-PF party. Jendai Fraser, US Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, former ambassador to South Africa, a relentless promoter of governance and good democratic principles here on behalf of Washington. Obi Ezekwesili, formerly a minister in Nigeria, now President for Africa at the World Bank. And Wendy Luhabe, Chair of South Africa's Industrial Development Corporation, which promotes new entrepreneurship through sustainability and economic empowerment. Welcome to you all. Well, Prime Minister Odinga, let me turn to you first. You've talked here of the soft underbelly of your society in Kenya, which was living the lie that your country was a comfortably united country since independence. What did your challenge to the presidential election result and the resulting violence expose for Kenya?
Well, Nick, you would say that the soft underbelly is becoming created by the imperial authoritarian presidency that has ruled over the country for a long time. And this is true of the rest of Africa, that the presidency came to emasculate all the other institutions of governance. So the people don't feel secure unless one of theirs is up at the top.
But what is about this soft underbelly? What do you mean by that? Living the lie?
That the country is a united nation, when in fact it is basically a conglomeration of various disparate ethnic groups that have come together. In other words, no attempt has been made to fuse these various ethnic communities into one united nation.
President Kufuor, in response on Kenya, you have said that people have worked together in Kenya for so many years. Then a flash. What triggered it? In other words, you're asking the question, based on your experience in Ghana, how can this happen?
It could happen because I came to find, face-to-face in Kenya, that perhaps a lot had been swept under the carpet from independence. Kenya was a nation that, in a way, was rushed into independence without the various component parts, and here I would say tribal parts, being made aware that they were being ushered into nationhood together. And over the period, with a very strong leadership under Kenyatta, it seems everybody played along, not really taking time to revisit the differences that were there embedded. And so recently, when the nation was confronted with the deep-seated differences through the presidential elections, these differences erupted.
How much do you think that's symptomatic still of, I've talked about the success of democracies and multi-party elections, how much is that still festering below the surface in many of the nations of Africa?
It might be there depending on what occasion would bring these hidden forces up front. And we wouldn't know till any of the nations came face to face with a critical challenge. But there's no doubt that given the artificial boundaries of the many countries that compose Africa now, perhaps on individual basis, any of these nations, when they come against their peculiar hidden challenges, they may go the Kenyan way.
How deep-seated, Prime Minister, do you think this remains in Kenya? Because you have said very clearly, we do not have time. We must have a sense of urgency, which we don't have at the moment. Are the mind walls and the great injuries, the mental injuries done by what happened at the end of December through January and February, can they be set aside? Look how long it's taken in the Balkans.
Right, yeah, but they can be actually resolved. And this is what I'm saying, that we don't have the luxury of time. We must get on with it. And what happened in Kenya is not unique to Kenya. It has happened also in other countries. So we say that we must move forward and try to reconcile the various ethnic communities in our country.
You're both still talking about colonialism. I mean, that ended many years ago, several decades ago for some countries. Why are you still talking about it when now this is about, the 21st century, almost the end of the first decade of the 21st century?
That's why I'm talking about the failure of the post-colonial leadership, not only in Kenya, but in the rest of Africa, to unite the people by creating what you call unity in diversity, capturing on that. You have the elite surrounding the leadership, the presidency, and using ethnicity as a tool for discrimination in a competition for distribution of resources in the country.
President Kufuor, you're very savage in the way you analyse this. You said colonialists didn't leave groomed leaders, but leaders who believe in winner takes all. Can that now change with this new push for multi-party elections and the new reality on this continent?
What I meant was that colonialism didn't leave us as nations, really. Colonialism imposed artificial boundaries on us and didn't allow leadership to grow. Leadership of national vision. Nations or states that were left behind by colonialism were not equipped with leaders that had been given a universal view of the succeeding states that came after colonialism. So that even though the front was there of nations, underneath most of us were not nations. So what we needed, really, and what we still need, I believe, is leadership that would be philosophical and visionary, seeing beyond our tribal and even sometimes national boundaries.
Right, let's look at the figures, and there are highly respected indicators now which come from the World Bank Institute. Let's go to the view from the World Bank, from the Vice President for Africa. You were a former minister in Nigeria, and you have to look at what is happening. You have to develop these nations here. You have to support them. What is your audit of how well countries are doing overall, or do we have to pick them off one by one?
What we've seen is a diversity. And what we've seen is that basically the trend looks positive, but there's still a lot to be done. The growth trajectory that we see in Africa is suggestive of the fact that the basic macroeconomic conditions of stability that would necessarily provide the ambience for the growth that then reduces poverty and deals with the problems of inequity will need to be emphasized more. There's still widespread inequity.
But there's a serious problem here. It's all very well you're talking about growth, particularly for the big resource-rich countries, but there is clear analysis from the World Bank Institute which says it's all very well having high growth, but that doesn't necessarily produce good governance.
But without good governance, you won't even start toward growth.
So which comes first?
It is an important precondition, but not a sufficient condition.
So which comes first, growth or governance?
That whole causality and the discussion of it will continue to be something of theoretical importance for economists. But one thing that is clear is that when you look at more prosperous nations, you find that most of them are democracies that have been sustained over a period of time. Now, does that mean that only democracies can really provide economic growth? Perhaps not so. But one thing that is very clear is that the irreversibility of a democratic culture is more pronounced in an environment where there is prosperity, because the people then have a stake and an incentive to keep the social order.
President Kufuor, I have here in front of me all these very deep statistics which are far too difficult to even begin to share with a large audience and you on the panel, but here's Ghana almost at the top of them. Which comes first, good governance or income growth, economic growth?
It's a question, the question of the egg and chicken, or chicken and egg. Which came first?
Well, which do you think for Ghana? Which was the egg and which was the chicken?
Well, I came on the scene when the economy of my nation was virtually down.
8 years ago.
8 years ago. Now, the world is saying Ghana is up again. I want to believe governance has been good to sort of kickstart or re-kickstart growth. So in that sense, perhaps governance is critical. It's more basic.
Right, well, let's pick up on this critical analysis from the President here, backing up what the World Bank Institute says. Governance comes first. Zimbabwe, a critical time as ever in your country. Let's look in the strategic long term. Tendai Biti, Secretary General of the Movement for Democratic Change. How do you define what is necessary in Zimbabwe after this current process to create a level of governance which is not right at rock bottom in every single indicator? You're virtually at the bottom of everything that I've seen.
Well, I think quite clearly and in our view, beyond any shadow of doubt, the issue of governance, the issue of constitutionalism, you have to start with that. The issue of institutions, one of the biggest deficits in Africa is the absence of institutions that not only protect democracy but guarantee democracy. And of course, a lot of the fault arises from the nature of the colonial state. The colonial state was created to serve a narrow minority. The colonial state was created to serve the metropole. And nationalism inherits this state. Nationalism is limited in its vision. Its key function is to de-racialize. One man, one vote, one woman, one vote. But it is limited when it comes to the agenda of economic emancipation, economic liberation. It's limited when it comes to the agenda of democracy. But in our view, democracy constitutionalism is a precondition for economic rehabilitation, economic sustenance, economic transformation. So in the context of Zimbabwe, it is fundamental that you resolve the political question first. You come up with a new people-driven constitution. You embark on a democratization agenda. This includes the repeal of a number of, if you like, restrictive apartheid-type pieces of legislation. That is critical. And then, of course, you can unleash your economic agenda and economic rehabilitation.
Well, let's broaden this out if we can. We've heard the Ghanaian experience. We've seen the awfulness of the Kenya experience earlier this year. What have you learned in Zimbabwe from the process you've seen in a country like Ghana, and what happened, the dreadful experiences in Kenya?
Well, I think the most critical lesson is that we are going through, if you like, a third revolution. There's a transition from the post-colonial order.
You're talking about that again as well, like everyone here.
Exactly, yeah. So people like President Kufuor, people like Prime Minister Raila are products of the failures and weaknesses of nationalism. So there's a generational ideological transformation that is taking place. My generation represents that. We are a generation of cheaters, the likes of President Mugabe and others, the nationalist generation, the generation of the past, the generation of hyenas. So there's a major transition that is taking place in Africa.
Jendai Fraser, you're US Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. This change that we're trying to identify here, particularly this generational change, the post-colonialist era, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Ghana, how do you assess this from Washington? You've been based in this region for many years.
Well, I think that all of the points are very accurate, that there is a generational change. I would describe it as democratic movements across the continent, and those democratic movements are somewhat ahead of institutional reform of the state. So we have this political legacy of winner take all. We have a political culture of life presidencies, which no longer are acceptable to the vast majority of African people. And so civil society and democratic movements are calling to account their leadership, as well as engaged in a struggle to change their institutions so that they're no longer winner take all.
Would you say Zimbabwe is perhaps the last example here in Africa of the clinging to power that you've just described?
No, Zimbabwe, unfortunately, is not the last example. And I don't think that Zimbabwe started as an example. I think that in the course of governing, sometimes leaders feel that they're indispensable to their nation. And they, of course, like the trappings of power as well. And so it's a process that any president or prime minister or any head of state could potentially fall into. But clearly, President Mugabe is one who intends to die in office. And there's clear that there are other leaders on this continent that have not yet made the decision that they should accept that peaceful transition of power.
One issue which tends to overshadow much of this discussion is, what does America really want in Africa? Someone like you as an Assistant Secretary of State goes around, like the President, talking about democracy. What do you mean by democracy in Africa?
Well, I think that we clearly want sustainable peace and stability as a fundamental interest of the United States, and built on that, prosperity. And I think that democracy underpins all of that, peace and stability, and prosperity. And so we are looking to help governments as well as civil society manage the many challenges that African countries will face.
But there's been a voice here, or 3 or 10, saying we want to do it on our own terms, an African model of democracy and pluralism, not what America's trying to ram down our throats.
Well, the United States is not trying to ram anything down the throats of any country. We're not prescribing a model of democracy. What we're prescribing is the interaction between civil society and building and helping strengthen civil society and responsible, accountable government. We're not saying how to design those institutions. In the case of Kenya, for example, it was clear that this issue of the establishment of an office of the Prime Minister